Al-Ghazali, he spoke about sexual pleasure or the orgasm. It is the greatest pleasure given to man. Why? Because it is a taste of the afterlife. And it's the greatest pleasure that one can experience. Now, other scholars like Ibn Hazm, he says sex is one of the greatest pleasure, but he argued that love, having that love and connection with another human being, that's one of the greatest pleasures. So you've got many scholars. I only mention these three because these are scholars that many people are aware of. The great erotologists, because there was many scholars dating back to the 9th century. One of our favorite scholars, Al-Jahid, he also wrote about erotology, but from a philosophical lens. So again, I know that a number of Muslims might be quite shocked about this, but that's because a number of these works haven't been translated into English. Most of these works are in Arabic. So you've got scholars like Al-Jahid, who wrote a book about erotology, but from a philosophical lens. You've got the great scholar like Akande as well, from the 9th, 10th century, wrote about sex and intimacy, a book called Kitab al-Bah, again from a philosophical lens. You've got Al-Kindi, I mentioned Al-Kindi, sorry. You've got Al-Razi, and you've also got Ibn Hazm, who wrote it from a philosophical lens. They want to explore sexuality, but from a philosophical lens. Then you've got another subgenre, which is called the sexually arousing, shall we say, form of erotology. And these type of scholars, what they wanted to do, they considered erotology as a science. People who are struggling with low libido, whether male or female alike, for them they considered reading about such stories or anecdotes, it can help increase their desire. So I'll talk about what was going on at the time. Some of them were speaking about bestiality, some of them were speaking about same-sex relations. Not that they were necessarily endorsing it, they were saying that these are the type of behaviors or sexual activities that people undertake, and these are the reasons for it. I'll name a very traditionalist scholar that many people are aware of, like Ibn al-Jawzi, the Hanbalis, the theologians. Very stern, harsh, but even if you read his book, which was recently translated into English, Discipline in the Soul, the Arabic name Tibb al-Ruhaniyya, I think it's called Discipline in the Soul. He's got a chapter on there about ishq. Ishq is like passionate love, and he's talking about some of the dangers of types of love, and he talks about ishq, which is a type of passionate love or infatuation or limerence. And the passage that he mentions, he speaks about a man being in love with a young boy, being passionately in love with a young boy, but then he says he has to do like jihad against his soul, not to engage in that, not to fulfill his desires that way. Again, we have to not idolize Islamic history or idolize our scholars, because they were human beings, and I think it's important to humanize them, because I think sometimes when people think about Muslim scholars, they have this idea that they only literally write or talk about the Quran and the Hadith, or Quran and Sunnah, when many of our great scholars of the past were polymaths. They were specialists in what is considered to be the traditional Islamic sciences, as well as many of, I don't want to say they're secular or dunyawi, but many of the sciences which aren't necessarily considered to be Islamic in nature, whether it's mathematics, whether it's philosophy, whether all of these different sciences, they also were specialists and experts in these sciences, or they were studying these sciences, and a lot of them, they derived their knowledge from what people said from before.
Thank you for the amazing 2 interviews that we've had. I won't even call it interview, the 2 discussions we've had concerning Al-Jahid. Now, many of our audience were initially shocked by some of the discourse, but I think over time we've come to realize that there is actually an opportunity for us to learn here, to broaden the perspective, to broaden our reading, and to explore a more profound and more diverse historical legacy as Muslims. What I've heard from feedback from many people is that it's kind of shifted their mentality and how they perceive the past, right? This romanticist, this perfectionist past has almost been drawn to the level of effectively, it's more relatable now. And there is more of an active awareness that we don't know everything about the past, so we may want to reserve judgments when kind of making statements in the future about present conditions and also about how we perceive the past to have been. So I really enjoyed that interview, and I think we should do more collaborations in this line of discussion to help the audience who appreciates this sort of discussion, inshallah. But I thought I'd bring you back because it was too easy to let you go with just 2 interviews. We needed more in terms of really discussing very, very kind of personal topics that every Muslim can relate to on an individual basis, on a daily basis, from the Muslim past. Al-Jahid was great. He was controversial. He was, in many ways, shocking for many people. But he wasn't the only one. And so I wanted to bring you back to discuss another very, very, you can say, colorful character in the world of Islamic literature and history, Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, and his work on love or intimacy, or you could say the more sensual side of human experience. But I'll allow you to introduce yourself first, again, for those who haven't seen the first two sessions. Tell us a bit more about your work and your specialty, your field of specialty, inshallah.
Shukran. Thank you again for having me. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Habeeb Akande. I'm a British Nigerian sex educator, historian, and erotologist. I studied Islam and Islamic law at Al Azhar University. Since I've came back actually 2009. I've been fortunate enough to write 7 books on race, sex and intimacy from an Islamic perspective, as well as the history of Muslims in Islamic history, as well as in Brazil. And I'm also the founder of the Erotology Institute, which offers online courses on Islamic sexology and African intimacy.
So you've mentioned a lot actually in terms of you studied in Al Azhar, which is a very esteemed, prestigious, and classical institute of Islamic learning, and you've come away from that experience with several books that you've written. We can see some in the background there: Taste of Honey, Kunyaza, and Illuminating the Darkness. What drew you to this topic of intimacy, and is this what the Muslim Ummah needs right now? You know, is this the sort of knowledge that the Muslim Ummah needs, and what exactly drew you to that? So what's the actual motivation for this sort of line of inquiry?
It's beneficial knowledge, and as Muslims, I think it's our duty to share that which is beneficial. And I think the knowledge of intimacy, love, the genre of erotology being the study of intimacy and sexual love is something which many Muslim scholars spoke about at great length for many centuries, especially prior to colonization. And for various reasons, I think it's a genre or it's a subject or an Islamic science that many Muslims nowadays are quite uncomfortable to talk about. We're more than comfortable to speak about how to get married, and even we can talk about maybe love, and we might touch on that a little bit that later. But in terms of like intimacy and sexuality, especially obviously with it between the confines of marriage between a man and a woman, I think that's a topic that many of us find very difficult, even many of us scholars and religious leaders, for various reasons. So whilst I was studying in Egypt, I came across many great scholars of our past, revered scholars who wrote about such books. I thought, okay, this would be, for me, one, it was quite inspirational to find many scholars that I revere and respect talking quite candidly about intimacy. But I thought it might be interesting to not only, because a lot of those books were written in Arabic, and I was fortunate to have access to Arabic whilst I was in Egypt. I thought it'd be quite interesting to not only translate some of these works, but also to talk about the diversity of opinions that many of the Muslim scholars had when speaking about love, intimacy, sexuality, female pleasure, a number of topics which are considered to be quite taboo in many Muslim circles nowadays. It wasn't considered to be taboo a few hundred years ago, where it was considered to be a very legitimate Islamic science to study such matters, and also obviously to benefit not only the Ummah but also non-Muslims as well. And I just think, like I said, I would like to be part of someone who's trying to revive erotology. So trying to revive the study of human sexuality within a God conscious framework. And what erotology is, it's not just about the study of human sexuality, which is generally known as sexology, but it's also studying sexual ethics and sexual morals within both a religious or philosophical framework. And I think as Muslims, I think it's important that we distinguish ourselves, because when we look at modern day sexology and sexologists, they generally talk about sex just within the realm of what science has to say. And there's no real morals and ethics that underpins some of their so-called findings. Whereas obviously as Muslims, we believe in Allah and we believe in obviously the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his guidance. So we have got a moral underpinning. We should have a moral underpinning. And then also can help certain issues that we may have where a number of people, they oftentimes mistake religion for culture. So there are certain cultural customs or norms or values that are considered to be inappropriate, but from a religious perspective, it's totally fine. So it's just also trying to help people understand the difference between what the religion has to say about certain matters as opposed to what certain people's cultures, because a number of people find the topic of intimacy and sexuality to be suffocating. And I would argue that it's because of their religion, because of their culture, as opposed to because of their religion. Because I would argue that Islam is a sex positive religion and sexuality is very much part of spirituality. So I don't think we should be shy or ashamed to talk about such matters. And it's not only something that one should learn about when one gets married or when one be married after a certain number of years, one should be well versed and educated about such matters even prior to marriage. And then when we look at our sources, whether it's the Quran, whether it's the Hadith, whether it's many works of Muslim scholars, it speaks very candidly about sexuality. So this is nothing new. I think where the disconnect has happened with many Muslims nowadays is that we don't have access to the Arabic language, so we're not aware of actually what the Quran says, what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said about such matters, and what many scholars have said. So when sometimes religious speakers are talking about such matters because they themselves are uncomfortable with this topic, they will maybe not naturally say everything. They'll just, I don't want to say hide things, but they'll just won't. Well, yeah, they'll probably hide things. I won't really say it is. In a way, I think one of my gripes, I think sometimes religious leaders infantilize the Muslim community and they make it out as if, you don't need to know about this until you're married. And it's like, whether you like it or not, people are exposed to love, intimacy, relationships from a relatively young age prior to marriage. They need to be educated. And if they're not going to be educated from Islamic sources, then they're going to go to non-Islamic sources, which hasn't got the ethics and morals that we should have, obviously, from the Quran and the Sunnah. So again, I don't think it's anything we should be embarrassed by. And not only do I want to, like I said, try and revive this tradition, but also want to try and empower and inspire other professionals in different fields to talk about this topic from their own particular perspective, because we're not living in 7th century Arabia, nor are we living in 15th century Egypt. So whilst I acknowledge and respect many of what our great scholars have written in the past, some of these works need to be refined and updated for modern day audiences. That's why we do need, the same way we talk about fiqh always changes. Likewise, erotology kind of will need to change in order to accommodate the needs of people nowadays, especially the contributions that women have. The contribution of women is kind of silent in amongst a lot of classical erotology works. So also trying to incorporate some modern day women sex therapists or psychologists to talk about their role in terms of how men can learn from women and vice versa. So that's in a nutshell why I'm quite passionate about this topic.
Okay, so let me be the angel's advocate in this one. I've never heard of a scholar writing about this topic, quite frankly, so convince me or give me the evidence that this actually is. If you've claimed that scholars in the past have written about this, sexology, to be very blunt, I don't believe this is part of Islamic knowledge. This is a Western influence, it's corrupting the Muslims and it's preoccupying them with things that are trivial. I've never heard of a book by any scholar. Give me a name of a scholar in a book on this topic.
Jalaluddin as-Suyuti,
As-Suyuti, the Mufassir.
Mufassir, the Muhaddith. So he's not only a great scholar of Hadith, a great scholar of Islamic jurisprudence, a great scholar of the Quran, a great scholar of history. He was also an erotologist or a sexologist, and he wrote over 20 books or 23 books on eroticism.
The Mufassir, I mean the Al-Hafiz, As-Suyuti, the one who was almost Mujaddid of the 15th century, the one who claimed Mujaddid. And you claim that he wrote not just one, but 23 books on this topic.
Yes. And even when we look at Hujjatul Islam, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, in his Ihya Ulumuddin, he speaks about sexuality.
Explicitly, as in like not metaphorically. I'm talking, are they engaging the topic in a candid and direct way? I'm not talking metaphoric explanation. I'm talking, are they actually taking this topic?
Al-Ghazali, he spoke about sexual pleasure or the orgasm. It is the greatest pleasure given to man. Why? Because it is a taste of the afterlife.
He connected that to the Akhirah.
Yes. He said sex is a foretaste of paradise, meaning the orgasm. And it's the greatest pleasure that one can experience. Now, other scholars like Ibn Hazm, he mentioned that, he says sex is one of the greatest pleasure, but he argued that love, having that loving connection with another human being, that's one of the greatest pleasures. So you've got many scholars. I only mention these three because these are scholars that many people are aware of, but you have many scholars before them. If anything, As-Suyuti is one of the last of the great erotologists, because there was many scholars dating back to the 9th century one of our favorite scholars, Al-Jahid, he also wrote about erotology, but from a philosophical lens. So again, I know that a number of Muslims might be quite shocked about this, but that's because a number of these works haven't been translated into English. Most of these works are in Arabic. And Asyuti is a scholar, like I said, that many people, both not only Sunnis but Shia scholars, also are aware of his works, and also there's Shia scholars who also wrote about sexology. So again, it's nothing new in our tradition, but unfortunately, for various reasons, many Muslims aren't aware of this because A, they do not have access to the Arabic language, and B, some of the works that have been translated, they're more academic books. So there's a great book written by a Tunisian sociologist called Sexuality in Islam, and he talks about erotology. There's another great book written by Shireen El-Feki, who is an Egyptian American journalist or British journalist. She wrote a book called Sex and Citadel. She speaks about the great erotology tradition in Islamic history, and she talks about a wonderful book written in the 10th century called Jawami al-Ladha, or the Encyclopedia of Pleasure. There's another
An encyclopedia.
Encyclopedia of Pleasure, yes. The Encyclopedia, a wonderful book. This is that book, that particular book. Asyuti, he derived heavily upon that book. So Asyuti was from the 15th century, and the Encyclopedia of Pleasure was written about 500 years prior to him, in the 10th century. And that book, although that scholar was, some people report that he might have had Shi'i inclinations, but he quoted hadiths, he spoke about obviously what the Quran says about intimacy. He quoted various scholars, not only from his period, but previous, obviously, before him. He quoted great scholars or philosophers from the Greek tradition as well as the Indian tradition. So a lot of the Muslims of the past, when they spoke about erotology, obviously first and foremost, they were speaking about from what the Quran says and the Hadith, but they also looked at non-Muslim sources, whether it's from Greek philosophy, ancient Indian erotology like the Kama Sutra. And I'll summarize. I mean, when we're talking about erotology, I would classify it into 4 subgenres. There is the genre which is like philosophical themed. So these are books written by primarily Muslim scholars talking about erotology, but from a philosophical lens. So you've got scholars like Al-Jahid, who wrote a book about erotology, but from a philosophical lens. You've got the great scholar like Akande as well, from the 9th, 10th century, wrote about sex and intimacy, a book called Kitab al-Bah, again from a philosophical lens. You've got Akande, I mentioned Akande, sorry. You've got Al-Razi, and you've also got Ibn Hazm, who wrote it from a philosophical lens. They want to explore sexuality, but from a philosophical lens. Then you've got another subgenre, which is called the sexually arousing, shall we say, form of erotology. And these type of scholars, what they wanted to do, they considered erotology as a science. People who are struggling with low libido, whether male or female alike, for them they considered reading about such stories or anecdotes, it can help increase their desire.
Wait. Books written to arouse Muslims. Am I hearing this properly?
Yes. Let me just first classify. I want to classify the 4 types.
Okay.
This is from our tradition. I'm just explaining the different types of reasons. So you've got the philosophical genre, like I mentioned, which is mainly from a philosophical lens, mainly looking at what ancient Greeks and ancient Indians had to say about erotology. So it wasn't purely from an Islamic lens, but they were still Muslim scholars. Then you've got the sexually arousing, or some writers have said it's like pornographic element, because
That's
Yeah.
literally what the word means, right?
I'm not saying these were Islamic, but I'm saying these were still Muslim scholars like Ibn Sina, who said this was someone who's struggling with low libido. He said this might help them to read such books, rather than have obviously actual relations, or they're struggling to have certain relations. He said it might help them to read about such titillating stories to help increase their desire. Then the third subgenre is the medical themed. And you had a number of physicians who wrote about erotology, and they're speaking about it from a medical perspective, according to their understanding, especially from what the ancient Greeks had said, what the ancient Arabs had said about erotology. And a lot of them, they derived from like what Aristotle had said about the 2-seed theory. And this influenced Muslim consciousness. So this idea was that ancient Greeks and a number of Muslims absorbed these ideas. They believed that in order for conception to take place, both the man and the woman had to experience an orgasm and ejaculate. And they believed that a man had a seed and the woman had a seed. And when both of those seeds intermingles, that's when the conception takes place. Now, we know in modern day science that's not the case, but this is what was believed at the time. So because the ancient Greeks believed that in order for conception to take place, they needed both male and female ejaculation to take place, a number of the Muslim scholars, they expanded upon this, and they said not only this is why it's encouraged for men to ensure that their wives are sexually satisfied and orgasm in order to help the woman conceive. And they looked at sex being not only should it be for that male pleasure, but it should be for mutual pleasure for the man and the woman alike. And they considered the mutual climax or shared orgasm to be the height or the epitome of sexual relationships. So that was in the medical themed type of erotology books. Then the fourth subgenre is what I would consider to be traditionalist themed erotology or Islamic erotology. And this is the type of works which the main sources are the Quran and Hadith, which govern sexual ethics, sexual morality. And this is where Asyuti fits in. So he fits in, like I said, and he came towards the end, but although it started, like I said, in the 9th century with the philosophy themed works, the latter books are more traditionalist Islamic themed. And what Asyuti did, he was looking at what a number of the early scholars have written, some from a philosophy themed, some from sexually arousing themed. He disregarded some of what some scholars have said, which were not Islamic. So some of the scholars spoke about homosexuality. That Asyuti, he doesn't incorporate that into his works because, again, that's not it's permissible in Islam. So, but with that which he considered that was beneficial from earlier scholars had written about erotology, even if it's from a philosophical lens or from a medical lens, he'll incorporate that into his books. But the overriding arc was what the Quran and Hadith says in terms of determining what type of behavior is permissible. So I'm saying this to say is that we have a rich tradition, we have a rich heritage of Muslim scholars writing about such matters. And some of them, like I mentioned, not all of their work restricted themselves to the Quran and Sunnah, because some of them, they saw themselves as social scientists or provided social commentary. So they'll talk about what was going on at the time. Some of them were speaking about bestiality, some of them were speaking about same-sex relations. Not that they were necessarily endorsing it, they were saying that these are the type of behaviors or sexual activities that people undertake, and these are the reasons for it. So again, it's just important that people understand this, because people may be surprised at how can a great scholar, like I'll name a very traditionalist scholar that many people are aware of, like Ibn al-Jawzi, the Hanbalis, the theologians, very stern, harsh. But even if you read his book, which was recently translated into English, Discipline in the Soul, the Arabic name Tibb al-Ruhaniya, I think it's called Discipline in the Soul. He's got a chapter on there about ishq. Ishq is like a passionate love. And and he's talking about some of the dangers of types of love. And he talks about ishq, which is a type of passionate love or infatuation or limerence. And the passage that he mentions, he speaks about a man being in love with a young boy, being passionately in love with a young boy. But then he says he has to do like jihad against his soul, not to engage in that, not to fulfill his desires that way. He wasn't endorsing that. He wasn't saying that this is Islamic, but he would just seek that a reality that there are some men who have desires for men, and there are some women who have desires for women. There are some men who have desires for women that they're not married to. There's some women who have desires for men that they're not married to. Let's look at the Quran. There's 12 chapters, Surah to Yusuf. We know that there was a woman that was married that had desires for Yusuf alayhi salam. She had love for him. She tried to seduce him, but of course it's not permissible, but you cannot deny she had that love for this man. And even when the women of Medina, is mentioned in the Quran, when they found out about this woman's attraction and what she was trying to do with Yusuf, what did they say? They said that she had a strong desire.
قد شغفها حبا قد شغفها حبا.
Because some people will say, how can you be in love with someone you're not married to? Of course you can be. It doesn't mean that you exercise that love. And this is again when scholars are talking about, or like Ibn Hazm talking about the different types of love that people experience and the different way it manifests. Now, again, we know Islamically, it should only be fulfilled within the confines of marriage or concubinage. We don't have concubines anymore, but just people understand Quranically, they're the legitimate outlets. But it doesn't mean that within Islamic history, there wasn't people having relations or having these desires, but it's how do you maintain it? How do you control it? And those who maybe have exercised those desires in a legitimate way, it then is like, okay, what do you do after that? You have to make repentance. You have to seek forgiveness from Allah. So again, we have to not idolize Islamic history or idolize our scholars, because they were human beings. And I think it's important to humanize them Because I think sometimes when people think about Muslim scholars, they have this idea that they only literally write or talk about the Quran and the Hadith, or Quran and Sunnah, when many of our great scholars of the past were polymaths. They were specialists in what is considered to be the traditional Islamic sciences, as well as many of, I don't want to say they're secular or dunyawi, but many of the sciences which aren't necessarily considered to be Islamic in nature, whether it's mathematics, whether it's philosophy, whether all of these different sciences, they also were specialists and experts in these sciences, or they were studying these sciences, and a lot of them, they derived their knowledge from what people said from before. And this is something, again, I think people need to realize, because when sometimes if someone comes across a scholar might have said something which is quite problematic, they might think, oh, is he saying this in terms of what the religion says? And he might be just relaying what he has heard or what other people say. And that's something that's very common with a lot of the Muslim scholars. The books they compiled, they were more of a works of anthology as opposed to pure um, original pieces of work.
Right.
And so they will talk about what different people have said. And you even see that in the hadith books as well, is that some of the scholars, that were, apart from, again, like the books of the Sahihain of Bukhari and Muslim, generally, a lot of the scholars that will compile hadiths that different people have that they've come across, not necessarily endorsing these hadiths. They'll be saying this is what people have said about a particular matter. So again, I just think as we become more mature and more educated, we need to have a more of a mature approach in terms of looking at Islamic history, and then also trying to contextualize, okay, why did this scholar say such and such, or why was he, or who was his, where did he study, what was his environment? But I think sometimes when people read about our Muslim scholars, they seem to think they were all the same, they all had the same personality, not knowing that some of them were known to be quite aggressive and struggled with that. Ibn Hazm also spoke about that, about him being someone that had a hot temper, and he struggled with that for a number of years. And there are some scholars who had jealousy as well. Some scholars who they had a bit of hubris, and they mention it. Al-Ghazali talks about his evolution and how he used to like to debate, and after a while he realized that, am I debating for the sake of Allah or for people's applause? And then he went into seclusion. So again, and you see that in their works, and that's not to say that their works are great, but again, what they were writing about, it might be because of what they were facing in a particular period. And generally, a lot of the scholars mellow over a period of time. So again, I just think it's important that we see scholars for who they were, esteemed intellectuals, inshallah, pious people, and people that wanted to seek the pleasure of Allah, but also first and foremost human beings. So we should humanize them and not be surprised that really a scholar said this. And I'm always wondering, are you not familiar with the companions? Because not all of the companions were ascetics, like just completely worshiping. Some of them, they had multiple wives. Some of them, they fought in the cause of Allah. So again, it doesn't mean that some of them, they just said, I'm only going to do 5 daily prayers, what's required of me. I'm not going to do any more or any less than that. There's, so we just have to have this reverence for and appreciation for the diversity, not only in the first community, but also amongst our scholars. They were not all the same in terms of how we, I think, maybe perceive how a scholar should behave or look like.
Okay, so let's get into the topic. This is a great introduction. The academic breakdown, which I appreciate a lot, because you've said many things that have me thinking already. Books that will entice people for the libido to rise. I mean, that for me, what kind of books are these, Is it even permissible from an Islamic perspective to have such books of immorality? Some may say today's kind of environments. Are these books genuinely Islamic? Number one. Number two, which category of knowledge does this come under? What's the title of this knowledge in terms of, if it is really traditional knowledge? I don't doubt you at all. But what's the title that the scholars gave it? Secondly, and then the third thing is, since you've mentioned Suyuti, which is a very, very well-respected scholar in many fields, can you help us with just looking into one of his books and kind of guide us through that? Maybe describe the title, some of the content, because it's a very fascinating topic. And I believe the vast majority of those listening to us right now have never even had an inkling such a genre existed within the catalogue of Islamic history or literature. So I think it's interesting to introduce this topic. But just give us a few kind of terminology. What's the name of this knowledge? It's not fiqh. Does it come under fiqh? Does it come under hadith? Does it come under tasawwuf? Does it come under, what does it come under? What's the title?
Yeah, so the title it comes under is Ulum al-Bah. Ulum al-Bah. So the knowledge of sex, or the art of sex. There's also another name, Ulum al-Nikah, meaning the art of marriage or the art of intercourse. As you would see, so originally it came, the original origin of it was Ulum al-Bah. So I mentioned Al-Kindi from the 9th century. He wrote a book called Kitab al-Bah, meaning the book of sex, because al-Bah was considered to be a medical science. So they spoke about sex in the case of how to treat sexual ailments or how to prescribe aphrodisiacs. So it was mainly looking from a medical perspective. Then it evolved to not only look at sex in terms of treating sexual treatments, but also how to enhance sexual pleasure. And they spoke about certain lovemaking positions from the Kama Sutra, and like,
Really?
then you had later scholars speaking about the Islamic contribution, meaning like what the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad peace be upon him
Sorry, brother
said.
Habeeb. Many of us have stopped. We've heard certain things, we've stopped. Our minds have just frozen. Scholars have written about sexual positions
Yes.
in the same way that
Mentioned-
Kama Sutra is.
Yeah. Well, why are people surprised? As Suyuti, in one of his books, he mentioned he relayed over 200 sex positions.
I need us to just stop for a bit. Sorry. Allah. Imam Suyuti, rahimahullah. And this is not just an ordinary scholar. This is like one of the giants. Has written a book wherein under Ilm al-Bah he describes more than 200 sexual positions. SubhanAllah. You know, this is, although it's kind of like a reaction, maybe many of our listeners have the same reaction, it's just like, really? So where has this knowledge been hiding, akhi? Because we live in an age of hypersexuality, and there are many Muslims who, unfortunately, if they have dysfunctions in the bedroom, they will have to go to a non-Muslim source of information. They have no alternative, seemingly no alternative. And so the only respectable outlet, maybe a sexologist or maybe a coach or maybe a program that is not governed by our ethics. It's not governed by halal and haram. It's governed by a totally different set of principles. But if you're telling me that we have books in our classical literature, not 50, 60 years ago, classical literature, that has already remedial impact in terms of how to fix problems in the bedroom, subhanallah, we've been robbed then. You know, we need this kind of work. So 200 positions, that really is not just like maybe 2 or 3 advice. This seems to me, as you've described, it's an intentioned effort to actually cement this knowledge, because it's not something that you write on the weekend. Clearly, it requires a lot of effort to research this information, to verify and validate it according to Islamic principles, to write it, to revise it. So really, I mean, what you've impressed upon me right now is that actually this was a legitimate field of study within classical Islamic texts, which for me is another door open. I never knew this. Well, I didn't know, but I'm kind of advocating. This field of knowledge existed within us. So why are we so deprived of this knowledge as Muslims, to the point of denying anything connected to this sort of knowledge in general? Why do you think that is? And what is the cure, in fact? What's the remedy? Once you tell us why you think that is, what may be the potential remedy? Because we need, wallahi, we need this. We need this knowledge.
I think the reason why many of us are deprived of this knowledge is because of colonization. I think following the colonization of much of the Muslim world, I would argue we adopted a Victorian Christian understanding of sex, where we consider sex, even within the confines of marriage or any discussions about sex, to be considered to be taboo and something that is not befitting of a Muslim. And this is reflected in the literature of the Muslim scholars following the colonization, where they stopped speaking about sex, or they looked at it as just an act for procreational purposes. And this was generally the understanding of Christians, especially Catholics, whereas in our tradition as Muslims, that's never been the understanding. The understanding is that sex is one is for procreation, but also is for sexual pleasure, for both the man and the woman alike. And the same way the man is entitled to sexual fulfillment, the wife is equally entitled to sexual fulfillment from her husband. So much so that many of our scholars have said that a woman is entitled to seek a divorce if she's not sexually fulfilled. And this isn't something that they have invented, something that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, ordained and he gave the woman the right to divorce from her husband who complained that she wasn't sexually satisfied.
You're going to cause a lot of divorces.
Because of this injunction, because of this ruling, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that's what inspired many Muslim scholars to teach men the importance of understanding the female anatomy and how to sexually satisfy their wife. If you know this is a duty,
Yes.
the onus is on you because you don't want your wife to leave you. The same way you put great pressure on yourself to make sure you provide financially, you should also put pressure on yourself to provide in a bedroom. And that doesn't just involve understanding different sex positions, it's understanding emotional intimacy, it's understanding how to connect with her. So all of these things, the scholars were well invested understanding women. And again, it's something which I'm quite flabbergasted by because this is within our tradition. You've got so many Muslim scholars, like I said, who've written countless books about this and primarily teaching men. Whereas nowadays in many Muslim societies or communities, the emphasis is placed on women have to satisfy the husband, when it was the opposite in prior to colonization, where more onus was placed on men to ensure that their wives were sexually satisfied. And you have this both within the Sufi tradition, traditionalists as well who said this. So it wasn't just one camp of Muslims. This was across the board, from Persia to
Okay, so let me ask you this, because this is really kind of really hard-hitting information here. Because generally, and I'll advocate, I think the way intimate relations in marriage, we can only talk about that because we're Muslims and we don't have, as you said, concubines, so this is the only outlet, is considered a man's right, isn't it? Because we know the hadith of if a man calls his wife to bed, she doesn't respond, the angels curse her all night, and if the man wants something, she should always drop everything. These are legitimate hadith, we're not denying them, okay? But the impression we may derive from that is, it's a one-way stream. If he needs it, it should be delivered. But what you're telling me here is that actually there is a reciprocal relationship whereby, yes, you may need it now, but you should also keep in mind you have to also deliver the same level of satisfaction to your spouse, right? So, and also there is a potential of she may, if she's feeling unsatisfied, it's a legitimate ground for divorce, although we're not condoning divorce. The rate's already through the roof. Are there any instances from the Sunnah of Rasulullah, any companions actually making this claim, any women making this claim that being unsatisfied? Because it's quite a heavy matter at hand in terms of kind of reading this.
There's several. And these are the same way we know about the hadith of, like you mentioned, the man's right to sexual fulfillment, but we don't talk about the hadith where the Prophet, peace be upon him, he told men that when you're intimate or when you make love with your wife, you should ensure, or should strive to ensure that she is sexually satisfied, and you should not leave her until she's satisfied. There's several hadiths that speak about that you shouldn't have intimate relations with your wife and leave her until she experiences an orgasm like you would like to experience an orgasm. For whatever reason, we ignore those hadiths. And again, I just think that we need the balance. So whilst we're all well aware of the hadiths about men's rights, but we're not aware of the hadith about women's rights. We're not aware of the hadiths that's mentioned in Bukhari, that's mentioned in Muslim, authentic hadiths of a woman complaining to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that she was sexually dissatisfied.
Like, oh, a Muslim woman, a Sahabi, sorry, I need to always, in the time of the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that a Muslim woman, a Sahabiya, complained that in her marital relationship she was not satisfied.
Correct, 100%.
Really?
In front of men. So she went to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam whilst he was with Aisha, and Abu Bakr was there in one narration, and she complained. He said that my husband has and she pulled the fringe of her garment, the hudbah, to indicate, and the scholars said it means either one of two things. Either he had a small member, meaning small penis, or he was sexually impotent, unable to sustain an erection, and she was dissatisfied. Now, when the Prophet saw this euphemism, he smiled because he knew what she was indicating, and then he wanted to clarify, have you consummated the
What was she indicating, Akhi?
that she was not satisfied because he was either impotent or he had a small penis.
And then therefore, what was the solution she was seeking?
She wanted out.
Oh, really?
Out
Divorce?
of the marriage. But she was previously married to another man, and one of the companions said, no, she wants to go back to her former husband. And then the Prophet, peace be upon him, he clarified that you cannot remarry your former husband until any subsequent marriage you have is consummated.
Okay.
So he just clarified what the Islamic ruling. But my point, and there's another hadith That's reported in Abu Dawood, where a man called Abu Rukana. So Abu Rukana, he was a man who had many sons, one of them being Rukana. He divorced his wife, Rukana, then remarried and then married another woman. And this woman that he married, she, shortly after their marriage, she went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and she complained. She said that my husband is useless, like in the bedroom, and she pulled a hair from her head, and she said he is as useless to me as his hair.
Subhanallah.
This is a hadith that's in Abu Dawood.
Subhanallah.
And then the Prophet, peace be upon him, he then called Abu Rukana to clarify what's going on. What's going on. And she wanted out for the marriage. Then the Prophet told him, divorce her.
Allahu Akbar. See.
Yes. This is hadith. It's available. So this is
So-
not anything new.
So
Like
this
them-
matter is that important because we know the hadith of divorce, right? There's a weak hadith, abghadul halal indallah at-talaq. That's the weak one,
But this
but
is
still
but this,
taken generally.
this is my issue. Again, I'm not for divorce. I'm not promoting divorce. I'm not advocating divorce. But what I'm saying is that because women have legitimate, not just because they're going to divorce you, but this is part of their this is part of their right to be sexually fulfilled. The same way as a man, we expect to want to be sexually fulfilled. That's why, because a lot of men are, they're not considerate in the bedroom. That is why even there's more hadiths that the Prophet is instructing men to ensure that their wives are satisfied than there are hadiths in the Prophet telling women to ensure their husbands are sexually satisfied. But for whatever reason, we know more about the hadiths about angels cursing the wives. We know more about the hadiths if you refuse your husband, don't refuse your husband even if you're on a camel. We know more about those hadiths when in reality there's only like one genre of hadiths with different narrations but the same meaning. But there's many hadiths of the Prophet telling men, do not go to your wife like an animal without sending sweet kisses and sweet words and kisses beforehand, meaning prioritize foreplay, prioritize her needs before you engage in intercourse.
So
There's many hadiths the famous hadith of Jabir, do not go at night, let her take time to get ready, to groom herself, to shave her private parts so she's ready for you. And then when you go into the bedroom, be affectionate, be gentle, and trace and case. So you have many, I can give you so many hadiths of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not even talking about
still stuck on the other hand. No, this is overwhelming right now, quite frankly. It is overwhelming, but as a Muslim, as a believer, and somebody who loves Rasulullah, it just inspires me really on another level because these are human problems being tackled with real solutions. It's not like, should it matter? It's marriage, iman, that's the only thing that should matter to you. Go and pray about it. If women are confident enough to bring these cases before Rasulullah, and he sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually investigates the matter, and then he's telling the man divorce her because if she's telling the truth, then you're not doing your job. That is really like, it's a shift in mentality, isn't it? Really, because now this is a serious matter that should be. Now I understand why books are written on this, because men need to know how to do this. Otherwise, it is a legitimate ground of divorce. So it's
And I don't want to say just always divorce because
divorce is not the focus of this. What I'm trying to illustrate is it can be that important that it can result in a divorce. Because if something is trivial, it doesn't result in a position where you seek a fatwa effectively. So if it's trivial, generally, it will never reach the level of I want a divorce for this. But if it can reach that level, that it means the topic itself of the issue at hand is genuinely a serious issue.
And there's another beautiful hadith. And again, this I think we can be inspired by and hopefully incorporate, whether one is an educator, a religious leader, teacher, or even a husband or wife themselves. So many jewels we can learn from another particular hadith when a woman went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and she complained that she said, my husband is like a woman in the house.
Subhanallah.
And what she meant by that is that he doesn't have intercourse with her. He's not like a woman can have intercourse with a man. And then the Prophet, peace be upon him, what was his reaction? He didn't say, Haram alayk, Habeeb. He called the man and wanted to clarify what's going on. And he called the man, the husband. The husband came and he asked him, are you not hearing what your wife is saying? What's going on? And what's interesting is the husband said, he used a beautiful expression. He said, my head is still wet. I mean, I've just recently performed a ghusl, that we were recently intimate. He was thinking, what's the issue? And then the wife said, we haven't been intimate in a month. So this is like an example where the man might have thought,
It's text as marriage, effectively.
well, it's not even really sex as married because it's still a month. He's thinking it's just where expectations are different. And
I see.
like one can think, I recently took it out, for example, to dinner. A man might think I recently took, and the wife was like, no, I expect to go every week or every couple of weeks. So this is like a communication gap. So, but the Prophet peace be upon him was the mediator in this sense. And then when obviously because the two still loved each other and they wanted to stay with each other, the Prophet made dua for them for Allah to bring their hearts together and to rectify their affairs. So again, this is an example where sometimes women might be shy to convey that message directly to the husband, or she might have, but he's not listening. So sometimes you need a third party to mediate. So again, this is for me, it's such a beautiful hadith because it's a human problem that people can relate to. But I think what's happened now in many Muslim societies or families or relationships that I hear a lot of women don't feel that they have the space to vocalize these concerns with the husband because the husband will shut them down or will accuse the wife of being loose or being immodest. Now, this is where we need to educate the men that if a woman is raising these concerns with her husband and she's legitimately allowed, shar'an, to raise these concerns, the men should have an empathetic ear and listen and not take it as a slight on his ego or think she's immoral or she's loose. And this is a problem where a lot of women are aware of these situations, but they feel maybe they aren't able to vocalize this. Again, you don't even necessarily need to go to a scholar or a counselor or a therapist just to speak to your husband. But if the husband thinks that it's not befitting for a woman to initiate intimacy or to ask for pleasure, that's the problem. So this is where we need to be educated properly in terms of what Islam says, as opposed to what some of our cultural customs and norms are. And this is something, again, like I said, a number of scholars are always addressing because as Islam spread, there were a number of fabricated hadiths and other ideas that came and influenced Muslim thinking. And to this day, and I'll give you an example of that, where you have, like in the book, it's either Al-Risala or Kitab al-Jami' by Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, who's a great scholar. He wrote a book and he spoke about a lot of his traditions. He spoke about what Imam Malik had said in a book called Al-Mudawwana. And in one of the sections, there's a passage about sexual relations. And someone asked Imam Malik, can a man have sex with his wife whilst they're naked? And he said, yes, there's nothing wrong with that. And then he said, oh, but it's been narrated that it's not allowed. And he said, consider that to be null and void, as in that's incorrect and then he relayed the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, saving and having relations with Aisha naked. And then there was someone else who asked, can a man look at his wife's private parts? And he said, yeah, it's perfectly permissible. And he said, again, but it's been
Imam Malik.
Imam Malik was asked that, yeah.
Subhanallah.
And then he said, no, it's perfectly fine. And then he said, because people are saying that it's impermissible. And again, he rebuked that and said, no, it's perfectly fine. Now, the reason why, and again, we have taken us back to the 8th century, Imam Malik's time, or 9th century, sorry. The reason why he was saying this was because at the same period in Baghdad, there were a number of fabricated hadiths that were being transmitted some scholars were also transmitted, narrating that if you look at your wife's private parts, it will cause blindness. Or if you speak during lovemaking, even with your wife, it will make you dumb. Or when you make love with your wife, make sure there's a sheet in between you. That's a greater level.
It is a Jewish, sorry, I've heard this from certain Jewish sects and communities. Yes.
It does in our tradition as well.
But did we borrow it from them? Because this, not to blame others, but I've heard this more from some of the more like ultra-Orthodox Heredain kind of.
No, I think this is where we need to be honest. It's also in our tradition. These are not authentic hadiths, but it's also in the tradition, and it's also narrated by a number of scholars, particularly Hanafi scholars, even in Hanafi books today. And there's a book called The Crown of the Believer, and it talks about like some of these etiquettes that even when you make love, you should wear a hat, like wear a taqiyya. And that's a greater form of modesty. And these are unreliable hadiths that they're relying upon. Now, again, I just for people to understand, because I don't want to slight any of our Hanafi ulama, is that they maybe believe that these hadiths were authentic, or if they were weak, because some scholars, this is again going into like understanding the science or Islamic jurisprudence, is that some scholars, they believe that even if a hadith is weak, they'd rather take that than nothing. So some scholars, I know nowadays a lot of people are anti weak hadiths, but generally, historically, most Muslim scholars said you can use a weak hadith if, unless its meaning clearly goes against the Quran or an established sunnah, and it's especially for matters to do with like virtue, like for da'in, like, or to encourage good deeds. So they consider this to be, even if it was potentially weak, they saw some benefit in it. So that's why even till this day, and I've seen some like fatwa online, especially from Hanafi scholars from the Indian subcontinent, where they say these things that do not look at your wife's private parts um when you're making love. Either have a cover, don't sleep with your wife naked because it's like resembling a donkey. And all of these are from fabricated or weak hadiths. So I can understand where they're coming from. Now, again, if you're raised in that climate, especially some of our brothers and sisters who have studied traditionally and they're hearing these hadith, that's why they will think, okay, this is like a very taboo topic. Like as in, when you make love, it's literally just to be for intercourse. When you lights off, you don't really talk. You don't talk with each other.
Mechanical, isn't it? It's mechanical.
Yeah, it's very mechanical. So this, if that's how you've been reared, that's why I can understand why even talking or writing or reading love manuals or eroticism about erotology is considered to be not from our religion. It just shows even in early Islam during the time of Imam Malik, you had two very different schools of thoughts, shall we say, in terms of lovemaking with the people from Medina and then also the people from Baghdad. And again, shouldn't be new to us who are familiar with our tradition, because even during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the people of Mecca and the people of Medina, they had different understandings in terms of what is considered to be appropriate intimate relations, where the women of Mecca were considered to be more, shall we say, adventurous and submissive to their husbands in the bedroom and engage in different positions, obviously vaginal penetration, but in different positions. Whereas in Medina, because of their custom and the culture at the time, particularly because of the influence of the Jews,
That's
they
what I
don't
was
believe that
trying to
the
look
only
to.
permissible or acceptable act was missionary, man on top. Any other act, they believe that a child will be born cross-eyed or what have you. So again, so when you had someone from Mecca marry a woman from Medina, then he wanted to turn the saddle, shall we say, and engage in intimate relations from behind, but in the vagina, which we need to make sure that's very clear. The woman refused because, again, according to her custom, that's not something that a good woman would do. So what was her reaction? Let's ask the Prophet, peace be upon him, let's clarify this matter. And he clarified that it's permissible in any which way as long as it's in the front area. And then the verse was revealed about Allah revealed about women being like your field to them, so go into your fields however you like. So again, this shouldn't be, and this also what inspired many of the Muslim scholars like As-Suyuti and others to write about the different sex positions. Now, even when Asyuti was writing about the different sex positions, one of the reasons behind it, not only to increase pleasure and fun between the man and the woman, but what was believed from especially the Indian erotologists, like with the Kama Sutra, the reason why he mentioned so many sex positions, like he mentioned, I think maybe up to 64, on some books mentioned hundreds, was because of genital compatibility. Because they believed if, for example, a man has a relatively small member and a woman has a relatively wider or elongated vagina, then there's certain positions that are more compatible. So it's all about mutual pleasure. But unfortunately, when the Kama Sutra was picked up in the West in the 19th century, translated, they were a very sexually repressed people. They just thought, oh, this is wow, like bedroom gymnastics. And they weren't understanding the rationale behind these positions. It wasn't just to have
Philosophy or the knowledge. Literally, it's like it's not just recreational. There is actual
there's purpose.
knowledge.
And this is where erotology is important, like I said, because with a lot of the Western sexology, shall we say, they haven't really appreciated the ancient knowledge, ethics, and wisdom that comes with these different traditions. So whether it's the Kama Sutra from ancient India, from Hinduism, whether it's the erotology, Ulim al-Ba or Ulim al-Nikah tradition from the Islamic Arab world, they haven't understood or appreciated that it's not just about hedonistic pleasure. And that's exactly Muslims. We have to also understand is that we're so surprised that Muslim scholars wrote about intimacy and positions because we have disconnected sexuality from spirituality. So that's a religious understanding. That's our misunderstanding of the religion. Because if you look at the Quran, there's various references to sexual relations, whether it's anal sex, sodomy, which is prohibited, it's mentioned in the Quran, whether it's mentioned how we were created from a drop of fluid, a drop of sperm, whether it's metaphors that's mentioned in Baqarah, in even during Ramadan, in terms of you're now allowed to have intimate relations with your wife. These are all in our sacred book. And if you are 10, 12, 13 years of age and you can understand Arabic, you'll be familiar with this. Now, because again, many of us don't have, or those who are not Arabic speaking, understand Arabic. That's why we're surprised. But if you understand Arabic, like when I was studying in Egypt from the high school, even though of course I was like in my 20s at that time, but this is people that are maybe like in their, I don't know, like mid-teens. They're talking about this topic. They're teaching it. So it's not new. Because it's in the Quran, it's in the Hadith, but we're so disconnected. And many of I would say the books that have been written and translated, they kind of ignore, or they kind of like, yeah, that's my issue. So I think when people get up to a certain age, they find it really difficult because of the image that they have of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and of his companions, is like somewhat of people who only had intimate relations purely for procreation purposes. And those, even scholars, didn't have issues or struggles with desire, or they didn't deal with people who had real issues that any human being or any couple would have. So, I just think we need to take off the veil and have a proper understanding of what intimacy is within our religion. And even some terms that unfortunately are thrown around often, like haya and the youth, understand what it was, how it was understood in those times, not now. Because people they often weaponize haya to the point where no one can seek any knowledge about intimate relations, because that means that the person um, lacks modesty. And like the concept of the term youth as well, how it's been like remixed, the original meaning to be now if any man is, even with his wife, is talking about something, then he's a dayuth, and that wasn't the original meaning. As many of our classical scholars have spoken about, dayuth refers to a man who is permissive of his wife engaged in illicit relations. So a man who doesn't mind his wife being promiscuous. That is not to say as someone's culture, in their cultural understanding, they're uncomfortable for different reasons with his wife being on the television. That's not a dayuth. That might be something that they're uncomfortable with in their culture, but to you, the Shari'an definition, and that's problematic. So you have all of these issues. That's why I think people are really disconnected or find the topic very difficult to broach.
So it has, I mean, there is a lot here to unpack. There's a lot, really. There's really a lot. We haven't even touched the topic yet. I see it as a manual. There is a lot. Compatibility. That alone, I mean, first of all, the recognition that that's a problem. We can go on for hours. Just the recognition that there is such a thing as compatibility from an intimate perspective. And then that there is almost a provision to write books to help remediate this problem. It just really kind of, the impression I'm getting here is really, this has been a serious topic of discussion for scholars. And in fact, I think it really is a shame that we don't have access to this in our modern English-speaking world, or maybe potentially even in the Arabic-speaking world. It may be buried beneath. But what I'm hearing here is actually really, really thought-provoking. A man is duty-bound to fulfill his obligation towards his spouse, intimately speaking. It's not just a command like Deliveroo, hey, I'm ready for it, put an order in, and if you don't respond, then just curse you. It's reciprocal, right? I'm ready for it, but I'm also ready to fulfill your rights. It's not just a one-way thing here. A question. So, I mean, it's a shame we don't have so much time to go into this. Maybe we can do a part 2 and part 3. It's really genuinely an important topic, because we live in an age right now, social media especially, everybody's a relationship coach. The gender dynamics and the gender agenda and war is just taken over the internet, and everyone has an opinion about compatibility, selection criteria, body count, performance, how often should a couple be together. But all of these answers are coming from outside the scope of Islamic guidance. And so if we as Muslims have this rich stock of knowledge, we ought to share it, but also to remind one another that this is an obligation. One of the things that I found a long time ago, I discovered a long time ago, is that and the topic of polygyny comes into this as well, right? men want to have multiple wives, a high value man, and it's usually an equation to do with how much you earn, right? They've pinned it on how much you earn. So if you earn a lot of money, you're entitled to have more than one wife. But traditionally, and the way I've learned this, is the only, like, the key criteria for having multiple wives is what? What's the key criteria for the man to be able to have multiple wives? That criteria is he can satisfy them intimately. Yeah. That's why I've learned it, that the criteria is not that you have enough money to buy houses for each one of them. That's nice. The criteria, and if you can't fulfill this criteria, no amount of money can help you, is that you can fulfill their rights to keep them chaste. And that's another element we need to talk about. If you can do this properly, you keep your spouse chaste, which is a massive half of your deen, is that, isn't it? And nikah is half your deen. But that half requires to keep your spouse covered, to keep them chaste. And to keep them chaste, they have to be satisfied intimately. So it's, again, I think we're raising this level from a maybe sensationalist topic title, but really it's a profound topic.
It is, and what I want to add, and so I know I didn't fully answer your question in terms of like the remedy, but it's important we diagnose the problem.
Absolutely.
Are aware that there is a problem, and then understand the importance of compatibility before rushing into what scholars have written and these different books. That people first need to understand that there's a legitimacy of scholars writing about this. So then, secondly, being aware of why they're writing about this and the problem that has always existed in human history. We have, inshallah, like somewhat of a remedy. We have had that remedy that we've been trying to access, whereas now we don't really have that remedy, or not many people are aware of these remedies or what people are trying to provide people. And this was something which, again, because I know I've said quite a bit so far, but a lot of what I've mentioned, that like the book that I wrote, A Taste of Honey, Sexuality and Erotology in Islam, that was a lot of aspect. It took me over 10 years to write because
Allah.
a lot of what I'm saying, I wanted to put it obviously in a volume where people can have access and they can see the references. Obviously, the book's written in English, but you've also got the references both in English as well as you've got the references of the sources that I got from Arabic in Arabic. Because for me, because obviously I've been studying this, I'm well aware of this for over a decade. It's like I'm thinking, aren't people? It's in sunnah.com. It's all available online, but then again, not everyone is going to spend the time to find this information, which I'm well aware of. The same way, there's a really brilliant book that I read in Arabic, has now been translated into English. تحرير المرأة في عصر الرسالة. Yeah, the empowerment of women in the era of the Prophet's lifetime, or something along those lines. It's translated. It's by Abu Hamid Abu Shaqqa, an Egyptian scholar. So recent, is a modern day scholar. He died recent, I think maybe 20, 30 years ago. He's a contemporary of Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, may Allah bless them both. But what he did, he wanted to collect authentic hadiths from both Bukhari and Muslim about what Medina, what Muslim society was like. And then he noticed all of these hadiths about like women, they weren't as restricted as they are in many so-called practices in how we've idealized Muslim society to be. And that's why he wrote this book, like the empowerment or women's empowerment during the Prophet's lifetime. This got one part is about intimate relations, and he's speaking about, again, he was an Egyptian scholar, but he was speaking about how many of the Muslims now, the way we look at sex and intimacy to be a taboo subject, whereas that wasn't the case during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And he relayed a lot of these hadiths, and that's a really brilliant book. It's really thin. It's been published by Cube Publishers. It's under the name Sex Education for Husband and Wife. That's a really brilliant book as well. Again, it's very concise, and it provides all of the evidence. So again, this isn't something that's new, but unfortunately, I think those who are teaching the deen, like I mentioned before, they're only speaking about men's right to satisfaction. They're not speaking about women's right. So again, the men who, when they look at polygamy, use an important word, they feel that they're entitled. Whereas the traditional understanding was that marriage, whether it's one wife or multiple wives, it was a responsibility. Not only responsibility to her, but also you need to sexually satisfy. Like, if you haven't been given that understanding, that knowledge, you just think, no, as long as I've got money and I can get another house, or even using governments, and that's not
discussion altogether, yeah.
thousand, I'm entitled to get a second wife, not realizing that that woman has needs, and if you cannot satisfy her, it doesn't just mean you can have an erection. You need to be able to satisfy her emotional and physical needs. And the reason why it's more important that people need to understand this nowadays than before is because maybe the requirements that a woman needed to be satisfied 300 years ago isn't the same now. And that's why you need to have a level of emotional intelligence and honesty to understand, would a woman be able to would I be able to satisfy her knowing that she knows I have another wife? And a lot of women, for different reasons, don't want that. And we know that the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he was asked why didn't he marry the women of the Ansar, he said because they couldn't take it, because they were insanely jealous. And he did not force them on it. So this is where, as men as well, although many of us would love to have multiple women, but if you know that it's going to be detriment to not only the woman, but also be her deen, don't go there.
Where's responsibility?
Yeah. If you're a responsible person, you need to be very forthcoming, or if that's your intention from the beginning, and maybe before you have your first wife, you have to be very clear and transparent. But if you're doing like not, or hiding your intention, or you're finding these like legal loopholes or these problematic fatwas that you can hide your intention, that you marry her, but you're hiding your intention that you're going to divorce her later. All of these problematic things that's not from the religion, but if you're someone who your akhlaq is not sound, you will think that, okay, this is what the religion permits me to do this. I'm entitled to do it. And this is why the reason why erotology, I think, as a science is so important, is because when you study fit in and of itself, it's giving legal rulings, and they're generally for a particular person at a particular time. Whereas erotology is teaching ethics, character. The same way when you read Bukhari, you've got the Sahih, which is authentic reports, but he also wrote another book, Adab al-Mufrad,
Yes.
teaching what? Character, how to refine your character, because going to a legal scholar is not always necessarily he's not going to give you tarbiyah all the time. But I think because we're just so used to the rights, my responsibilities, and we look at relationships as being transactional, both for the man and the woman alike, I give her, maintenance, and she gives me her body, without understanding how do you cultivate a loving relationship, how do you cultivate an atmosphere and environment where she was comfortable in your presence. This is something you're not going to get from a fiqh book. It's not that, because that's not their speciality. Their speciality, they're telling you what the conditions are or something, what fulfills a marriage.
There's the mechanism, there's the maintenance. The mechanism is the nuts and bolts of it. Right? The maintenance is the caring element to preserve that institution. That's the behavioral aspect of things, the psychology of it, the ethics of it. And I think you're right, we need that, because I think many of the issues that modern human beings, Muslim or not Muslim, quite frankly, we're suffering is the abundance of sensuality and sex in public, right? Whether people are engaged in it or whether they're exposed to it through media such as music or films, the abundance of that can desensitize us and can also trivialize, the sanctity, quite frankly, of this act. So we do need some sort of remedial help. I speak for myself and everyone else, really, quite frankly. We need help because what you've outlined here very eloquently is that it is an amana. It is an amana, right? That as a man, you need to equip yourself before marriage, during marriage, to be able to carry out this amana. You're looking after your spouse, not just physically, not just financially. We typically stop there, but also emotionally and also intimately. And she has, although we're not advocating it, but there is legitimate legal grounds within Islam for a woman who is not satisfied. There is a ground for grievance, right? So it is a serious matter at hand. It's not just a trivial issue. Again, I really do kind of wish we had more time. We haven't even touched the topic of Suyuti, but give us a bit of a taster for what maybe can be a second discussion. Which books are available to us in the English language for those who want to begin this journey? Tell me about your book, Taste of Honey, for example.
So, A Taste of Honey, it's quite a comprehensive read, if I'm honest, now I've been advised. I wrote A Taste of Honey in 2015. It came out, and it explores sexual ethics and the art of lovemaking. It's about 300 pages, but I wrote a more concise version called Women of Desire: A Guide to Passionate Love and Sexual Compatibility. Now, that book, a number of people have actually been said they would actually advise people to read that book first because it's easy to digest, and then maybe, especially people more studious, to read A Taste of Honey. But I probably would recommend Women of Desire first, although I initially wrote it aiming at women, but men could also read it as well. It was written, I wanted to first speak about some of the common desire and orgasm problems that many women face and to normalize it. That is in the sense that if one is struggling, whether one is not married, like struggling with their desires, or in marriage, or how to communicate with their spouse, that's perfectly normal. And there's different, and I'll provide various recommended books in the English language for them. I also provide a summary of historic women, sex educators, female scholars in Islamic history, which many people are not aware of. So we know of, and I've mentioned some women who've complained that they're not being sexually satisfied, but also some scholars and female intimacy educators from our tradition. And a quick example is, and this was mentioned by, narrated by Abdul Malik ibn Habeeb in his book Adabun Nisa. He reported that Amara bint Abdul Rahman, who was a scholar in her own right from the Tabi'in, she was a student of our mother Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him. She asked a beautiful question. She asked, "How did the Prophet make love to his wives?" And Aisha, because again, this is from our religion, the most affectionate and gentle of men, always laughing and smiling in the bedroom. And this is the benchmark. So this is teaching women, this is what you're entitled to. Your husband should not be rush, aggressive, not considerate of your needs. So women know that they're entitled to be desired and to be pleasured. And likewise, it's teaching men, this is how we should be in the bedroom. The same way the Prophet, how he advised Jabir, who was a young man when he was getting married. So you have and other women like Hub al-Madaniya, who was from the era of Uthman ibn Affan, who taught sex education to both men and women alike in a genre known as an art form known as al-ghunj, which is the art form of like moaning and groaning. I'm not going to go into all of that.
SubhanAllah. This is early on. This is Sayyidina Uthman's era. Like,
This is way before Asyuti. So the same way we're looking at Asyuti and Al-Ghazali, Al-Ajahid, they were being inspired by during the time of the Prophet peace be upon him and the companions. So we have precedent of this. So that's why, yeah, Women of Desire is probably a good starting point. Then A Taste of Honey, especially if someone wants more, to learn about the different positions. I'll go into more detail in A Taste of Honey. Talk about taboo subjects like oral sex. I know it's quite taboo for some Muslims, but there isn't any concrete evidence from the Quran or its authentic hadith that prohibits it. So that's why most scholars will say that it's permissible. There are some scholars who dislike it, and that's more for cultural reasons as opposed to there being a clear prohibition. So I'll speak about that as well as other things. So in terms of if you want to understand erotology and the academics behind it, other books in Arabic, probably A Taste of Honey is probably my recommendation, but a more practical guide, the starting point, and understanding like that there is a precedent for scholars talking about this, then probably Women of Desire is probably a starting point. Ibn Hazm's book, Al Hamama, that's been translated as The Ring of the Dove or The Pillar of the Dove, that's been translated a few times in English. That's also available online, like PDFs. There's a number of, if you just type in The Ring of the Dove, really brilliant book, a treatise on love that was written in the 11th century from Andalusia. Most of Asyuti's works I've not come across an English translation, but to be fair, most of the hadiths that he relates, I translated them and I put them in my book, A Taste of Honey. And the way Asyuti wasn't really original writer. A lot of his works on erotology was more of a compilation, like a compilation of what scholars about what Quranic references to sexual intimacy and what some of the Salaf had said about interpreting certain verses. Then he'll narrate some hadith. Then he'll narrate some maybe akhbar, like reports from some early scholars about sex and intimacy. He might relate some poetry. Then he'll relate some anecdotes from both non-Muslim and Muslim sources. But he doesn't really always give his opinion on matters. So it's really like a compilation of such. Whereas if you want like an original piece of work, Ibn Hazm's work is brilliant for that. Tawq al-Hamama, or The Pillar of the Dove, or The Ring of the Dove. That's definitely a recommended read in English. Ajahid, some of his work's a bit more comical and satirical, but we spoke about him, so you could obviously head over to that episode and the book Sobriety and Mirth that was translated by Jim Corvell. Another thing, actually, I think to be fair, I'm not a fan of feminism, so I just want to put this disclaimer. But
Okay.
the works of a number of Muslim feminists have been quite important in terms of addressing this issue in the sense of why many Muslims have found this topic to be quite uncomfortable, or why many Muslims have become prudish. Many, I would argue, to be mainly a lot of feminists and a lot of Muslim sociologists who have actually saying what's happened. Like, we had a great past. He wasn't prudish as we are now. What's happened? There's a really good book called Women and Gender in Islam by Layla Ahmed. She speaks about, and because she just looks at how women were and how they were sexually empowered, or not really sexually empowered, but empowered in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So what she argues, which I disagree with, she puts forth the argument that it was the Muslim scholars who basically wanted to instill patriarchy, then they invented all of these hadiths to subjugate women.
Okay, so it takes a left turn quickly.
There's some interesting points, especially for your mature person. You can read something, if that which you disagree with, you don't have to obviously take from it. But Layla Ahmed's book, Women and Gender Islam, is a really interesting read. Another Muslim feminist, Fatima Manesi, she's got two books, Beyond the Veil, Male and Female Dynamics in the Muslim Society, and the second book, The Veil and the Male Elite. Again, similar to Layla Ahmed, she puts forth that similar argument, as in she blames Muslim scholars. I don't agree with that. I don't believe the Muslim scholars invented these hadiths, but she does talk about how women were more sexually liberated during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which I think that's definitely the case, and they were more empowered. So she's tried to restore that that golden age of Islam, and she also cites Al-Ghazali in terms of showing how there were some Muslim scholars who spoke about women's right to sexual satisfaction. So and Fatima Manisi's book is great. There's another excellent book by Pernilla Mine, who's a Swedish. She's not Muslim though. Hopefully she embraces Islam. Swedish academic who wrote a book with female sexuality in the early Islamic world. I was fortunate enough to meet her when there was Arab Erotology conference I attended in 2016 in Paris, and she gave a presentation as well as I gave a presentation on the taste of honey. And subsequently, she's released this book a couple of years ago. Excellent book. It talks about what many Muslim scholars have said about female sexuality. Great scholars, a lot of references to books in English, but she obviously was well versed in Arabic, so she's providing sources in Arabic. So again, for anyone who's maybe a mature reader or an academic, I definitely would recommend that book, Female Sexuality in the Early Islamic World. They're the three probably main books I would, but again, there's some, I don't agree with all of their conclusions, but she does, and interestingly enough, Vanilla Mine, she goes against Layla Ahmed and Fatima Manesi in terms of blaming the scholars, because she doesn't say that, because she gives examples of the Encyclopedia of Pleasure and As-Suyuti showing that there was scholars who were speaking about women's right to sexual satisfaction. The same way in many Muslim communities, many people believe that women don't have the right to pleasure. It's all about male fulfillment. But that's because of what they've been taught. But they haven't heard the hadiths and the scholars speaking about women have just as equal right, just as the men. So that's one of the things that I really like about Pernilla Mine's book. And strangely enough, I had to come from a non-Muslim to kind of to address that, which some Muslim have kind of just blamed the scholars, which I don't think is fair. I mentioned Sexuality in Islam by Abdul Wahab Boudiba, really good book. And then there's another book called The Arab Kama Sutra by Malik Shibal, who was a Moroccan sociologist. He died, Allah mercifully, so a decade ago. But again, he talks about how the prudishness that is in the Muslim community, it came as a result of colonization. And he speaks about our lost tradition of speaking about intimacy and relationships and things like that. So, and the final book is, I mentioned Shireen Al-Feki's book, Sex and the Citadel. So I'm saying this to say, because they all come from, you've got different sources and they're all saying the same thing. And so it's not new. It's just that the people that have been interested enough talking about this are either speaking Arabic or French. So all of those writers, apart from Shireen Al-Feki, are French speakers, and the rest are like Arabic speakers. So that's something that I noticed that, okay, why is it a lot of North African writers? The last person I'll mention is Salma and Naomi. Salma and Naomi, she wrote The Proof of the Honey. It's a novel book, but she does mention As-Suyuti and Al-Jahid, and talks about the rich tradition that Muslims had speaking about sex and intimacy. So I'm saying this to say that this isn't new, but for whatever reason, many Muslims haven't been exposed to it, and it might be because of the circles that you've attended. So we shouldn't say that this is new in Islam or Islamic history. It's just that maybe what you've been familiar with, you haven't heard about such.
It's been limited.
If you want more, obviously my institute, Erotology Institute, break down into more detail at a slower pace, because I know I've spoken quite a bit, and contextualizing some of these matters for people who are interested in not only learning the history, but also some modern day problems they can hopefully resolve some intimate problems they have in their relationship and marriage.
So a bit on that. So you literally have an institute, right? As far as I know, it's the first one. I've never come across an Islamic institute on erotology ever. So if you don't mind, just for the benefit of listeners, for those who really are seeking, you could say, halal or real solutions for certain problems they have, tell us a bit more about this institute. What does it offer? Where can we find it? Um, and what are the resources that you're actually offering?
Yeah, so the Erotology Institute, I have to say, Jazakallah khairan to you, Ustad. You really inspired me to actually set it up because it was on my case for a number of years. But it's an institute where I provide online courses on Islamic sexology, African intimacy, breaking down a number of things, whether it's the history of sexuality and intimacy from an Islamic perspective and contextualizing what some scholars have said. I give more detailed book reviews. I also provide some practical advice drawing upon what sexologists have said, sex therapists have said on modern day issues, whether it's vaginismus, whether it's first time intercourse, like on the wedding night, whether it's regular issues that men face, whether it's premature ejaculation, erectile dysfunction, and providing some sources. So I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't prescribe any. So I don't recommend any particular aphrodisiacs, but I'll give some recommendations in terms of it because a number of issues that people have is not actually physical problems; it's psychological. So a lot of people they have an issue whether it's their miseducation of sex, so they need to have a correct education, understanding of the body, or have a correct expectation as because some people have unrealistic expectations because of what they've been exposed to, whether it's by way of porn or friends. So it's about giving concrete, accurate sex education, and both from an Islamic perspective and also what modern day sex researchers have said, and also debunking because there's a number of like scientific studies that have come out that when you actually look at it deeply or properly, the sample size is like 10 people, 15 people. But people will use that and the media will often use these studies and sensationalize it and make it out like this is for everyone. Like there was a recent study that caught fire online where it was reported that men need to have sex 21 times a month. So there was a Nigerian doctor who came out and said, yes, men need to have sex 21 times a month to reduce the risk of prostate cancer. That was the headline. Now, when you actually look into it, sample size at that time was only maybe I think 3,000 people, so still quite significant. But the difference was quite minimal. But they made it out, and the way it was advertised or marketed was if a man doesn't have sex 21 times a month, he's then get another wife or another woman or like a side chick. And it's just like, again, that's completely unethical. It's not from the dinner to and then we're using this as in evidence to pressurize them like, you need to have sex with me, otherwise I'm gonna get cancer. And it's just like no, but this is some of the manipulation that I've seen and heard. I've heard people say, and this is about this the love but this is I've heard someone say if a woman really I've heard someone say this a woman was told that, and this is a true story, that if her husband told her, if you don't, in order to conceive, you need to give me oral sex in order for her to have a child because they were struggling to conceive, to have a child. So she said, if you give me oral sex, then you can conceive after we have sex. And there's a lot of people, and these are a lot of people that's living in a village far away, that's away from like modern day. Like, there's a lot of people that are living in metropolitan societies, cities that are unaware of that. I think that believe in all of these myths, all these erroneous reports, or because someone will use a scholar said this or scientific report said this, they believe it. For a number of people, science has become the new precious, as I say. So I kind of debunk, kind of break down and contextualize some of these studies because there's a lot of like I said, sexual myths that are quite common both from a religious perspective and also even in modern day science, and try to contextualize and not everything because sometimes people do ask questions where they just want, is it halal, is it haram, can I do this, and oftentimes that's not the question. It's not really a case of is it halal or haram. It's compatibility, whether if you're uncomfortable with something or you're comfortable with something, but your other half isn't, then it's the case of if he's uncomfortable, she's uncomfortable, how can you maybe have that communication to get to middle ground? It's not a case of he has to do that or she has to do that oftentimes, but because people aren't having effective communication and they don't have the vocabulary to communicate effectively their needs, their desires, um, and their insecurities, that's why a lot of people are in sexless marriages. A lot of people are sexually dissatisfied, and a lot of people are committing adultery, and we just have to be honest with that. And there's a number of reasons for that, and because a lot of people don't have the space to have that honest conversation with their partner, with their spouse, or even maybe seek professional help, a lot of people will find that they're suffering in silence. So again, with the institute, it's a case of giving many examples of how people have maybe struggled with certain issues and how they've overcome them. Because I don't, like I said, I'm not pro divorce or anything like that, but it's to let people know that a lot of people, what they're going through, they're not alone. A lot of people are suffering from different forms of intimacy struggles. It's not that they are abnormal or something's wrong with them or something's wrong with their spouse. It's just that this is part of the human condition. So fortunately enough, we have people who are empathetic and someone who's trying to be understanding to try and give, if it's not something that I can potentially help with, then provide outlets for people who, whether it's like I said, a psychologist, sex therapist, counselor, or just really to have honest conversation with their partner, um, about addressing some of these issues. So that's a lot of what I'm trying to do with the Erotology Institute. And yeah, it's something that I've not spent as much time as I should have, and you've been on my case on that. So, but that's something that inshallah I want to definitely invest more time on that, because I do believe it is a need, and hopefully it could be a form of beneficial knowledge for the Muslim community. Inshallah.
And is it something that's accessible only in person? Do they have to attend like physical
Oh
seminars?
yeah, very good question. So at the moment it's all online, so you don't have to, and the courses and things are all pre-recorded. I do have, so there is a free tier structure in terms of the subscription. So like for the higher tier, you can have like maybe like one-to-one like debriefing, like contacts with myself. But at the moment, the way I've structured it, as in that all of the courses are online, pre-recorded, and obviously, but there is a portal if people want questions or they want.
Yeah.
But at the moment, I'm not providing one-to-one um counseling services or mentoring as of yet, but that's something that I may do in the future. But at the moment, it's providing people with, inshallah, beneficial knowledge and information. But there's also, like I said, room for if people have got questions or queries, then I'm more than happy to kind of respond or um, divert them to someone who can obviously also help them.
Excellent. And for those who want to be practitioners of this, to effectively embark on the journey of really learning, is there any scope for that kind of activity with your institute?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, the institute is targeted at individuals, couples, and sex professionals, meaning sex coaches or sex educators, sex therapists. I've not yet developed a certification program because people have asked me that a number of times, and I've been fortunate enough to travel to a couple of countries where, like, I went to Curacao a couple of years ago in the Dutch Caribbean, and they were like really. So the person that invited me was she's a sex therapist and sex coach. She was asking me to set up a program. I haven't done it as of yet, but a number of the people that attended the event were sex coaches and sex therapists, because I think a number of people, especially non-Western people, and when I mean non-West, I mean non-white, they know that they've got their own cultural traditions, whether it's from Christianity, whether it's their own cultural traditions, but they need a space where they're legitimized or how they can communicate that effectively, because the model that is often used from the Western perspective, it doesn't really fit their particular culture, whether it's from, because they're not understanding of their religion or their cultural values. And that's something that, like I mentioned earlier, why I think erotology is particularly important, and argue just as important, if not more important, than sexology, is because you need to be empathetic to people's cultural needs. It's not just about halal haram from a religious perspective. One needs to be culturally competent. And that's why oftentimes when I receive messages and things like that, it's not a one word answer. It's not a yes or a no. That a lot of times, sometimes people are looking for, because one needs to understand the impact. One needs to understand the person who's asking this question, and the consultant they're coming from as well. It's very important. And this is something that is from our tradition as well. When people talk about fiqh, I know oftentimes people are very quick to say halal and haram, but a true faqih, a true jurist, you'd be very careful from saying something is halal or haram unless it's clearly, explicitly stated. like in the Quran or authentic hadith.
So again, I've said this already several times in this discussion. I genuinely believe, and this is why actually we've had a discussion, many discussions in the past, and I'll say it. I mean, I have definitely bought into the idea that we as a generation, as like you said, the Muslim diaspora, the English-speaking Muslims, we need an avenue and outlets to enable us to have access to this knowledge, because at the moment it is inaccessible. Okay, either you're gonna have to go to the original Arabic and be a researcher effectively. It's not the capacity everyone has, or rely upon others to bring the knowledge. But we know this is a very difficult topic to break down in public sphere. So we're left effectively as a community struggling with very basic problems that can contribute, not necessarily cause, but contribute to the breakdown of family dynamics. So if we know that there is a legitimate case, legitimate, you could say, precedents in Islamic history where scholars have treated this remedial process. It's not trivial, it's a remedial process that there is advice, there are techniques, literary techniques. And I know even from the prophetic tradition, Jibreel alayhi salam actually gave advice to Rasulullah about aphrodisiacs, certain types of meat, right, and soup strengthens the man. So there is definitely a legitimate and a very authentic source of information dating back to the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What we need more than anything now are halal and principled means of access to this knowledge. Because as I said before, those who are struggling with certain issues of intimacy, it appears as if the only way to seek solutions is to go to other, sex kind of counselors, or maybe coaches, or people worse yet online on Instagram and TikTok. And this is where they get the right data. There's sort of knowledge and conditioning as to the male-female relationship. And really, I think that's more than drinking poison. It's worse than poison, in fact, because it's unqualified, it's unprincipled. And in many reasons, I believe this kind of advice that's being proliferated online is contributing more to the toxic wave of how men see women in a negative light, adversarial relationship, right? And how women in turn also see men from an adversarial perspective. So I couldn't commend your work enough. Honestly, I think it's come at a time where we need it. We need this now. Maybe 20 years ago, this would not have been a topic of discussion whatsoever. But I think in an age where we're seeing younger people, especially, because what I've noticed in the last 2 to 3 years is that just general survey of social media, boys especially are being cultivated, are being conditioned very young, from the age of 13 to 14, even younger than that is cool, to have a certain perspective of intimate relations, how they see the woman, almost like she's an enemy, like someone to effectively, it's like there's a battle between the genders, and young boys are being told to behave a certain way to get something out of the relationship, right? And so I think it's weaponizing something that's very beautiful, something that is very, very precious, something that should be preserved and cultivated and nourished and respected, has become effectively just like just in abundance. And it's really kind of, there's a grotesque approach to it, right? So I think this kind of work you're doing right now is very essential. And I really hope that the Institute really kind of gains prominence, because we need it. Many of the issues that we've discussed in this very lengthy discussion here are very real experiences for people. They're very real. I'll give you an example. That book, Behind Your Taste of Honey, I came across it accidentally in a bookshelf, right? But then I purchased it, and I've given it as gifts to friends who have been married for many years. And every single time they receive a copy of that, it's almost like, wow, I never knew. It's a new portal. It's literally a portal. I never knew this was there. And I myself looked at it. Wait a second, I never knew this was a possibility. But what I found is that anyone who actually came across this book, or even had like an inkling of, oh, is that what the book is about? There's genuinely a receptiveness to it initially. I need to know more about this, right? So there is a need. That's the point I'm trying to make. There is definitely a thirst for this knowledge. There is a need. And what I would actually, to commend the work again, is that it is very well referenced. A topic such as this one cannot go without references. I'm sorry. You would not get away with writing a book such as this without solid references, because typically our first response is one of denial. No, this definitely didn't. No scholar has written this before. So this is either a fabrication or it's a modernist attempt to kind of reinvent Islam. That's how people typically defend themselves. It's just a modernist event. He's trying to make things up to kind of fit into Western convention. But no, the references are very solid. And also the names are very, very familiar. I mean, I'm reading names. I'm like, wait a second. Ibn Battuta. He did certain things. He was a connoisseur. That's probably many of us know. But it really is, it's refreshing, it's reassuring, but it's very necessary. Genuinely, and I've said this, in private conversation with friends, said every household needs to have this book. It's not an understatement. Wallahi, every household needs to have this book. And every man should actually study the book. Before marriage, after marriage, it's a testimony. It's not flattering. I'm genuinely speaking to you as a testimony. I have heard brothers, I've given them the book, listen, read this book. And it fixes a problem that maybe previously he was silent about, because it's, where do I go for advice? Where do I even go to discuss this issue? But the book opens up the possibility to kind of say, oh, it's been acknowledged. Oh, so this actually is a problem, right? Or here's a solution I could try out. So it is a tremendous work, and I think potentially, I don't know, maybe at some point in the future, we will see kind of a general kind of approach where people will kind of cite the book more often, will perhaps take it as kind of like an initiative to begin really developing that side of things. We need it in the world we live in right now. We need this sort of scholarship. So thank you for that excellent work, and we need to get you more often. You need to be part of this setup more often, because you've written about other things that I think would be of great benefit for Muslims, generally speaking, not just erotology or history, even the experience of people in Brazil. Of another very fascinating topic that no one talks about, and a rich history, Brazil and the islands and Islam. So we need to have you more often on this program, inshallah. And I will just continue saying to you, as I said always in private, continue doing what you're doing, akhi. We need you, We need people like you in this ummah. So barakallahu feekum. Any final words of advice for those who have listened up until now and now want to do something? So institution has been mentioned, the website will be on the screen, the books have been mentioned, but just somebody who's kind of potentially has been suffering in silence. Just one piece of advice. Where should they begin?
Well, to know that you're not alone, and many people are going through what you're going through, but there's help available. First and foremost, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then there are also people that can help you. So I think that's very important, because I think both men and women are like, a lot of people are suffering in silence, but just know that you're not alone, and there is help there's help available. So that's definitely the main takeaway. Hopefully people will to take away from this.
Barakallahu feekum, and thank you once again. Jazakallah khair.